Okay, everyone, we'll get started. I want to welcome you to the 2011 California Preservation Foundation webinar series. I'm Corinne Garcia, Director of Education at California Preservation Foundation, and we're happy to have you here for the webinar, Accessibility and the California Historical Building Code. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that all the attendees will be on mute throughout the webinar. If you need any assistance or if you have a comment, please write that in the question box. And some of you had sent questions in advance, and we'll be covering those questions at the end of the webinar. If we're not able to get to your questions, we will, if you could email me, and then I will pass it along to our speaker. And today's speaker is Arnie Lerner. Arnie is AIA CASP, which is Certified Access Specialist, who is a principal at Lerner and Associates Architect. And he has been practicing architecture, preservation, and accessibility in San Francisco and the Bay Area for the past 26 years. And his work has included both private and public sectors. His recent projects, where Arnie played a principal role, were the accessibility modifications to the Alameda Courthouse, the accessibility and restoration modifications to the Del Mar Theater in Santa Cruz and the Cerrito Theater in El Cerrito, accessibility and life standard modifications to the Haas Lilienthal House, and accessibility survey of Berkeley Housing Authority properties. And he was also a joint expert in the settlement and monitoring of the accessibility lawsuit, Gassersten versus the Regents of University of California at Berkeley. And now with that, I will hand it over to Arnie.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Are you having problems?
Not in my control.
Okay.
Trying to go to the next slide.
It should be working now, Arnie. Let me do that one more time.
Okay. You got your little bars at the bottom, too.
Sorry about this, everybody. Arnie, why don't I just forward the slides?
Okay. You want me to just say next?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, next. Okay, as Corinne mentioned, this is a little my background. Being a licensed architect and a certified access specialist with the Division of the State Architect, and won a number of design awards from CPF for accessibility. I'm on the Access Appeals Commission for the City and County of San Francisco, and these others, as you see. Next. As you know today, for those of you who are architects, Senate Bill 1608 requires that you get continuing education and accessibility of 5 hours for each time you want to renew your license. And for those who participate today, CPF will be sending you certificates that you can then send in when you renew your license. Next. So this is an outline of what I'm going to cover today. What is the California Historic Building Code? What is the State Historical Building Safety Board? Who can use the California Historical Building Code? How does the Historical Building Code apply to access for persons with disabilities? The Americans with Disabilities Act, the 1991 ADA, and I'll explain how that integrates into the building code along with the 2010 ADA. The Department of Justice, Department of Justice Certification and the Historical Building Code, use of alternatives in the Historical Building Code, minimum ADA requirements, the Secretary of the Interior Standards, Historical Building Code alternatives with examples, the 2010 ADA, and determining compliance dates of the ADA and California Building Code access regulations. Next. What is the California Historic Building Code? The California Historic Building Code is the 8th of 12 parts of basically the building code, which is known as Title 24. The Historical Building Code is unique among state regulations in that it required state agencies promulgating regulations for building construction to work in harmony with representatives of other design and construction disciplines. The result was a totally new approach to building codes for historical structures, which maintains currently acceptable life safety standards. These regulations are unique in that they are performance-oriented rather than prescriptive. The authority for use of the California Historic Building Code is vested in the Health and Safety Code, which states the building department of every city or county shall apply the provisions of alternative building standards and building regulations adopted by the board in permitting repairs, alterations, and additions necessary for the preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, moving, or continued use of an historic building or structure. Next. The State Historic Building Safety Board has interpretive and appeal authority for determining equivalency and acceptability of designs that are proposed as equivalent or reasonably safe alternatives to the prescriptive mandates of the regular code. The board is composed of qualified experts representing state and local public agencies, professional design societies, and building and preservation-oriented organizations. The board adopts rules and regulations pursuant to the California Historic Building Code and adopts and submits alternative building standards for approval by the Building Standards Commission. And lastly, the board has created 3 ways to access, review, and appeal. They are information requests with the executive director. You can email him questions, Richard Conrad. It allows consultations with the executive director and the executive committee. And lastly, it will hear appeals from any party if the issue is of statewide importance. Next. Who can use the California Historic Building Code? In order to use the California Historic Building Code, the structure under consideration must be qualified by being designated as an historic building or structure. Section 18955 states that for purposes of this part, a qualified historic building or structure is any structure or collection of structures and their associated sites deemed of importance to the history, architecture, and culture of an area by an appropriate local or state governmental jurisdiction. These shall include structures on existing or future national or state or local historical registers or official inventories, such as National Register, the State Historical Landmarks, State Points of Historical Interest, and city and county registers or inventories of historical or architecturally significant sites, places, historic districts, or landmarks. Next. What is the purpose of the California Historic Building Code? The CHBC is intended to provide solutions for the preservation of qualified historical buildings or properties, to promote sustainability, to provide access for persons with disabilities, to provide a cost-effective approach to preservation, and to provide for the reasonable safety of the occupants or users. The CHBC requires enforcing agencies to accept solutions that are reasonably equivalent to the regular code when dealing with qualified historical buildings or properties. Next. How does this California Historic Building Code apply to access for persons with disabilities? The regular code for access for persons with disabilities is in Title 24 is Chapter 11B in Volume 1, Part 2. And this shall be applied to qualified historic buildings or properties unless strict compliance with the regular code will threaten or destroy the historical significance or character-defining features of the building or property. Provisions of the historic code do not apply to new constructions or reconstruction replicas of historical buildings. They apply to alterations of qualified historic buildings and are defined as any construction or renovation to an existing structure other than a repair or an addition. Basically, what this has said, and this is often misunderstood, I didn't say next yet, is that you cannot use the historical building, that for every historical building and resource must use the regular code just as any other property would, unless you can show that doing so would cause loss of historic resource. Applying the alternative provisions. Alternative provisions for access may be applied only on an item or case-by-case basis. Documentation needs to be provided, including meeting minutes or letters stating the reasons for the application of the alternative provisions. And these provisions in the California Historic Building Code, and this is out of the code, state that they apply to local, state, and federal agencies, Title II entities, alteration of commercial facilities and places of public accommodation, Title III entities, and barrier removal in commercial facilities and places of public accommodation, also Title III entities. Just what are Title II and Title III entities and barrier removal, and why are they referenced in the California Historic Building Code? Next. Title II and Title III entities and barrier removal are parts of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA is a federal civil rights law. It's not a building code. The ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. To be protected by the ADA, one must have a disability or have a relationship or association with an individual with a disability. An individual with a disability is defined by the ADA as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. The ADA does not specifically name all of the impairments that are covered. Next. The titles of the ADA, there are 5 of them. Employment, number 1. 2 is state and local government activities. 3 is public accommodations. 4 are telecommunications. And 5 are miscellaneous. There are currently 2 versions of the ADA guidelines in effect, the 1991 and the 2010 standards. While the 2010 ADA standards are being reviewed for inclusion in the 2013 California Building Code, the 2010 California Building Code refers to Titles 2 and 3 of the 1991 ADA, and I'll talk more about the 2010 ADA standards and compliance dates later. Title 2, again, state and local government activities, covers all activities of state and local governments, requires that they give people with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from all of their programs, services, and activities, are required to follow specific architectural standards in new construction and alterations, must relocate programs or otherwise provide access in inaccessible older buildings, are not required to take actions that would result in undue financial and administrative burdens, and are required to make reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures where necessary to avoid discrimination unless they can demonstrate that doing so would fundamentally alter the nature of the service, program, or activity being provided. Next. Title III covers public accommodations, and these are businesses and nonprofit service providers that are public accommodations, privately operated entities, offering certain types of courses, privately operated transportation and commercial facilities. Public accommodations are private entities who own, lease to, or operate facilities such as restaurants, retail stores, hotels, movie theaters, private schools, convention centers, doctors' offices, homeless shelters, transportation depots, recreation facilities, and including sports stadiums and fitness clubs. Public accommodations must comply with specific requirements related to architectural standards. And additionally, public accommodations must remove barriers in existing buildings where it is easy to do so without much difficulty or expense, which is the definition of readily achievable, given the public accommodations resources. Next. Barrier removal. The California Building Code states that alterations, structural repairs, or additions consisting solely for the purpose of barrier removal shall be limited to the actual work of the project. In other words, barrier removal, which is voluntary, doesn't trigger additional work. Under the ADA, removal of barriers, a public accommodation has had an ongoing obligation since 1992 to remove architectural barriers in existing facilities, including communication barriers, which are structural in nature, where such removal is readily achievable, i.e. easily accomplishable and able to be carried out without much difficulty or expense. Where a public accommodation can demonstrate that removal of a barrier is not readily achievable, public accommodation must make its goods and services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations available through alternative methods, if such methods are readily achievable. Next. I'm getting to how this applies to the Historic Building Code. The Department of Justice, under Title 3 of the ADA authorizes, the Title 3 of the ADA authorizes the Department of Justice to certify that state laws, local building codes, or similar ordinances meet or exceed ADA standards for accessible design for new construction alterations. Congress, by authorizing the certification of state and local accessibility requirements under Title III, recognized the important role that state and local building standards may play in achieving compliance with building-related aspects of accessibility, and in any legal challenge that might be brought under the ADA to facilities constructed in compliance with an ADA certified code. Compliance with the certified code constitutes rebuttable evidence of compliance with Title III of the ADA. The CBC, the California Building Code, has been in the process of becoming certified for a number of years, but has not achieved it so far. But, next slide, the California Historic Building Code is certified. The State Historical Building Safety Board negotiated directly with the Department of Justice to certify the 2007 California Historic Building Code, which is now the 2010 code. It appears that the California Historic Building Code is viewed by the Department of Justice as a standalone code because it is enabled by statute and therefore able to be certified separate from the regular code. The California Historic Building Code states that the alternative minimum standards for alterations of qualified historic buildings or facilities are contained in the 1991 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. So that's how the building code is linked to a civil rights law. Uses of the California Historic Building Code. In the ADA, 1991 ADA Standards, and it's section 4.1.7 of the 1991 Standards, section 202.5 of the 2010 Standards for accessible design, they both basically state, and you'll hear some of this repeated, where alterations are undertaken to a qualified historic building or facility that is subject to the Section 106 process, if the State Historic Building Preservation Officer, the SHPO, or Advisory Council on Historic Preservation agrees that compliance with the requirements would threaten or destroy the historic significance of the building or facility, the alternative requirements in the ADA may be used for the feature. Same goes for qualified historic buildings and facilities not subject to Section 106. The Department of Justice has certified that the application process outlined in the Historic Building Code according to the has certified this process. According to the SHPO in California, neither the SHPO nor the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation are involved in the decision, and it is responsibility of the local government authority as to whether alternatives can be used. And this is specifically for projects that are not subject to Section 106. Section 106 is not addressed in the California Historic Building Code. There was an intention to, but it has not been addressed. The minimum ADA standards are at least one accessible route to an accessible entrance, at least one accessible entrance which is used by the public. The exception is if it is determined that no entrance used by the public can comply, then access at any entrance not used by the general public but open and unlocked with directional signage at the primary entrance may be used. The accessible entrance shall also have a notification system where security is a problem, remote monitoring may be used. You're going to see a lot of this in Excel, repeated verbatim in the Historical Building Code. The ADA says if toilets are provided, then at least one toilet shall be made accessible, and then accessible routes from an accessible entrance to all publicly used spaces on at least the level of the accessible entrance shall be provided. And access shall be provided to all levels of the building where practical. And it also talks about displays and written material, and this is a should, be no higher than 44 inches above the floor. Next. It also states the California Historic Building Code is intended to work in conjunction with the United States Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties and guidelines for preserving, rehabilitating, restoring, and reconstructing historic buildings. And the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties and guidelines for the treatment of cultural landscapes. So in developing alternatives, they have to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards as well. The following are the alternatives and examples of their application in the California Historic Building Code. Building entries. And this is very similar to what I just read from the ADA, that these alternatives do not allow for exceptions for the requirements of level landings in front of doors except as provided in the section about automatic door openers, and I'll talk about that a little more later. Access to any entrance used by the general public and no farther than 200 feet from the primary entrance. Access at any entrance not used by the general public but open and unlocked with directional signage at the primary entrance and as close as possible but no farther than 200 feet from the primary entrance. And I just want to make a note about signage. In my experience, so much can be accomplished by good signage in terms of wayfinding, and it's often overlooked and not paid that much attention and can cause a lot of problems when people don't pay attention to signage in terms of wayfinding. Third, the accessible entrance shall have a notification system such as an intercom where security, this is the alternative, accessible entrance, where security is a problem, remote monitoring may be used. Next. Here are a couple of examples. This is the Alameda County Courthouse, where the original plan was to provide ramps and mechanical lifts going across the front of the building, which would have had quite an impact on the ceremonial entrance. But by looking at the side entrance, which is to the left of the photograph of the building, and realizing that the corner from where everyone accessed the building had the same elevation as the main floor, and there was a big light well where we could put a walkway that you see on the left, and modifying the storefront entrance, we were able to enter on the side entrance. Below is a project by a carrying company where it wasn't readily achievable to provide an entrance to the front of this historic structure, and they provided a ramp and an entrance on the side of the building. Next. The historical building code talks about doors. And it's very important when you're looking at the section 8-603 that you go to the appendix, because the appendix has all of these requirements in tables, and they talk about some of these requirements do not apply, where they apply and don't apply. And for doors, it's especially important. It's also a little confusing, and I'll explain. Basically, the alternatives for narrower door widths, where you have a door where widening the door and changing the door would cause loss of historic fabric. You're only able to allow these alternatives when you do barrier removal. So in other words, if you're doing an alteration project, you cannot apply this alternative. It's only when you're doing voluntary barrier removal, which is aimed strictly at removing barriers to access, that you can apply this. Next slide. There's been some confusion as to whether the alternative door widths apply to projects that are barrier removal based on the following note at the bottom of that table I just showed. It says, exception. Alternatives in this section do not apply to alteration of commercial facilities and places of public accommodation, Title III entities, which is a little confusing as to why Title II entities could use this in barrier removal and Title III entities cannot. I reviewed this subject with TSA and with the executive director of the safety board, and it was their opinion was that the barrier removal option can be applied to Title III entities if all the conditions for applying alternatives in terms of it being a qualified historic building are met. Next. This is a project that we're working on where it was pretty much impossible to provide access through the front entry of the Hostel-Lilienthal house. And so on the side, where we're going to remove the steps, create a short ramp, and then this side entrance, where we're then going to lower this entrance, but we wanted to reuse the original door and the original opening. We're applying that alternative I just spoke about. Next. Power-assisted doors. Power-assisted doors, or doors that may be considered an equivalent alternative to level, may be considered an alternative to level landings, strike side clearance, and door opening forces. Basically, you need to have a level no more than 2% level landing on either side of the door, the push side, which is where the wheelchair is stationed now, or the pull side. Actually, it's written right on there. Strike side clearance. Sometimes you're not able to provide space on the side of a door for the wheelchair to position itself to open the door, or door opening forces, which there are limits on the number of pounds of door opening force required. Next. This was a project, this is the Taddage Grill in San Francisco, which is the oldest business in San Francisco, having opened in 1849. This is not the 1849 location, but the doors did not provide adequate clearance, and so we used a power door operator. The owner then also wanted to provide those minimum clearances for a single door, and so we applied, and you can kind of see them on the left, these swing clear hinges, which are very helpful in adding about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of the door clearance, pulls the door out of the opening. Next. Toilet rooms. In lieu of separate gender toilet facilities as required in the regular code, an accessible unisex toilet facility may be designated if there is a problem with making the existing restrooms readily, making them accessible, or it would destroy historic fabric. This is the Regency building in San Francisco, where it would have, besides wiping out a number of the fixtures in this building where there is a lot of use, also would have destroyed these historic fixtures themselves. And so the solution was to provide a unisex restroom on the floor nearby. Next. These are two other projects, the Veterans Memorial Building in San Leandro, where the bathrooms could not be easily made accessible and a unisex restroom, and the Sequoia Theater in Mill Valley that we worked on, where it would have completely wiped out the fixture count. It had been one toilet for men and one for women, and these were the historical bathrooms, original bathrooms in a movie theater, and we provided a unisex restroom. There's an alternative. Exterior and interior ramps and lifts. A number of doorways will have maybe an inch or an inch and a half threshold, and the alternative to lowering that doorway or changing that entrance would be if a lift or a ramp greater than standard slope would not be allowed. You can have a slope, a standard slope of a ramp of 1 in 10 for a short distance, and you need to install signs at the upper and lower levels indicating that you have a little steeper slope. Or if it's only for a short distance, you can go to a 1 in 6 slope for horizontal distance not to exceed 13 inches. And here's an example of that below. And again, you need to post signs whenever people are using a ramp that's less than the standard maximum slope of 1 in 12. Next. Equivalent facilitation. Historical Building Code in 8604 talks about equivalent facilitation, which is the use of other designs and technologies or deviation from particular technical and scoping requirements. They are permitted if the application of the alternative provisions contained in the Historical Building Code themselves would threaten or destroy historical significance or character-defining features of the building or property. In other words, if it opens up the proposal for alternatives other than those listed in the Historical Building Code to try and provide access. Such alternatives shall be applied on an item-by-item or case-by-case basis. Access provided by experiences, services, functions, materials, and resources through methods including but not limited to maps, plans, videos, virtual reality, and related equipment at accessible levels. I know in the Haas-Lilienthal house, there is a level we're not able to provide access for fully motorized wheelchairs, and as is the case, and it mentions this in the Historic Building Code, we're providing a video of that area, of those areas that are not accessible, to provide some experience of those levels that are out of reach. The alternative design or technologies will be used will provide substantially equivalent or greater accessibility to and usability of the facility. The building official needs to document the reasons for the application and include the opinion and comments of state and local accessibility officials and the opinion and comments of representative local groups of people with disabilities. For that video at the Haas-Lilienthal house, we did retain a disabled person, a wheelchair user, to review that alternative and got them to write a letter that they thought this was reasonable considering the site and the alternatives we had. One note about unreasonable hardship. Unreasonable hardship has been removed from equivalent facilitation in 2007. Only threatening historic fabric is acceptable, and that's important. In terms of equivalent facilitation, if you do use equivalent facilitation, in Title III entities, equivalent facilitation for an element or a building or property when applied as a waiver of an ADA will not be entitled to the Federal Department of Justice certification of this code as rebuttable evidence of compliance for that element. So in other words, if you use if you use an alternative not listed in that table, then that's okay, but you are not protected under, in case if there's a lawsuit about the ADA. The California Historical Building Code is unique among state regulations in that they are performance-oriented rather than prescriptive. This allows for the consideration of alternatives to requirements that would damage or destroy historic aspects of a site. The threat of the waiver could diminish the important role the California Historic Building Code plays in finding reasonable alternatives. So it's important that that is considered a waiver. Equivalent facilitation. Basically, this is a slide provided to me by Tim Brandt in the Office of Historic Preservation, where they provided this temporary ramp. Basically, temporary ramps in the code, in the regular code, are allowed on stages and enclosed platforms of a certain height and elevator pits. Their use as equivalent facilitation was applied to this project for entry into a building. The use of portable ramps are mentioned in the implementation language of the ADA, but it's only when the installation of a permanent ramp is not readily achievable. The conditions under which local authorities will accept these ramps must be negotiated if part of a building permit. And we're currently in process in San Francisco of discussing with the building department and other departments about the conditions under which they might accept the use of a portable ramp. Once someone can show that there just is no possible other alternative of getting into the store. What about the 2010 ADA? The Department of Justice published revised regulations for Titles 2 and 3 of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 in the Federal Register on September 15, 2010. The 2010 standards for state and local government for facilities for Title II consist of the following. In 2004, the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines, the standards, were revised. It wasn't, but of course it took 6 years for that to actually for them to revise the overall ADA. So they've been sitting there for 10 years, but for 6 years. So it's the 2004 ADAG, and then in 2010, there were a number of other items added to the 2004 ADAG, which is the box on the right. And when you combine those two, that's 28 CFR Part 35.151. When you add those to the 2004 ADAG, you get the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design for Title II entities. Next. The 2010 ADA Title II, that those new construction alteration requirements, they consist of these items, which include alterations to historic properties. And they talk about compliance dates, scope of coverage, social service center establishments, housing at a place of education. And I should have mentioned before, the regular code for Title III entities that the Historic Building Code is based on is Chapter 11B of Title 24. And the reason it's not 11A is because 11A deals with housing, and the ADA does not deal with housing. This Title II new requirements deal with assembly areas. They have new requirements for assembly areas, medical care facilities, curb ramps, facilities of residential dwelling units for sale to individual owners, and detention and correctional facilities. Next. The 2004 ADAG includes these 10 chapters: application and administration, scoping requirements, building blocks. This is it's organized differently than the 1991 ADA, and now they've taken all the general requirements, doors and elevators, and put them into building blocks, Chapter 3. It talks about accessible routes, general site and building elements, plumbing elements and facilities, communication elements and features, special rooms, spaces and elements, built-in elements, and recreation facilities. Title III is basically, again, the 2004 ADAG, as well as 28 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 36, Subpart D. These together equal the 2010 ADA standards for Title III. Next. And these include, along with the 2004 ADAG, new construction, alterations, alterations to path of travel, alterations dealing with elevator exemptions, alterations for historic preservation, standards for new construction and alterations, including places of lodging, social service center establishments, housing at a place of education, assembly areas, and medical care facilities. I assume this little box on the side means I can keep going. Oh, Corinne, no, I can't hear you.
Yes, you.
Now I can hear you.
Yes. Yes, we still have 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. And then there are the 2010 requirements, and basically they talk about being a qualified historic building to be able to apply the alternative methods. Next. Again, it's about the application of the alternatives, and again talking about the SHPO and the Advisory Council being able to determine whether it's required, and again in California, for buildings that are not subject to 106 review. That's the local level, not the SHPO. Next. The 2010 ADA exceptions talk about accessible routes, about accessible entrance, very similar to the previous code. Next. Talks about toilet rooms and unisex toilet. It talks about program accessibility. Next. Determining the compliance dates for the ADA, Title II is based on the start of construction. You'll see that Title III is based on when you apply for a permit. So basically, any building that started construction before January 26, 1992, but before September 15th of 2010, the 1991 standards, or UFAS, were applicable. And UFAS, the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, are standards that a number of federal agencies apply, and particularly HUD, because they do deal with housing. The entity must use the select, and then after, so between September 15th in 2010 and March 15th, 2012, you have a choice of using either the 1991 standards, UFAS, or the 2010 standards. After March 15th, 2012, only the 2010 standards can be used. And the important thing is that you have to use one or the other. You can't pick something you like out of the 91 standards and something you like out of the 2010 standards. No cherry picking. The ceremonial groundbreaking and raising of structures prior to the site preparation do not commence physical construction or alterations for Title II entities. Next. Here's a brief word about UFAS. It's basically a standard that is also used by the General Services Administration, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Defense, and the Postal Service. And again, as I mentioned, the ADA doesn't address housing, and therefore agencies such as HUD use UFAS for this purpose. Next. For Title III, the compliance date is for the receipt or application of a building permit or building permit extension. And again, the dates are the same. Before September 15th, 91, before September 15th, 2010, it's the 91 standards. Between September 15th, 2010 and March 15th, 2012, it's one or the other. And after March 15th, it's only the 2010 standards. Next. For the California Building Code, again, the 2010 California Building Code is based on the 1991 ADA standards. The 2013 California Building Code, DSA is now reviewing the 2010 ADA standards and will prepare responsive California revisions for the 2013 CBC. Public vetting of this process is occurring now through the DSA Advisory Board. If you would like to receive notification of meetings where access codes issues are discussed, contact Richard Conrad, Executive Director of the DSA Advisory Board. He's also the Executive Director of the State Historical Building Safety Board. He's a busy guy. At richard.conrad@dgs.ca.gov or call him at area code 916-324-7180. Next. Here's some references for information about the ADA, and this is really important, and I use this a lot. The Department of Justice, the Access Board, has a toll-free information line, 1-800-514-0301. You can call them up and ask them questions about the ADA, and it's very helpful. The Accessibility Office at the National Endowment for the Arts provides a variety of resources for museum operators and historic properties, including Design for Accessibility Guide and Disability Symbols, and you can contact the NEA at 202-682-5532 or www.arts.gov. For the applicability and effective dates of the ADA CBC, the Division of the State Architect has a bulletin, number 11-07, which you can access on their website. And then I also wanted to throw in something that's important, a reference to look at about dimensional tolerances and good design practices. Because a lot of the problems that people run into in access start in the design stage, and where people don't take tolerances into consideration of designs. And the Access Board has taken the initiative, and they retained David Ballast to start developing guidelines for dimensional tolerances, as well as good design practices. And you can access that. You can go to the www.doj.gov, the Department of Justice website, the ADA website, and under this www.access-board.gov/news/tolerances-report.htm. You can look at that report. You can also look at the Division of the State Architects website for their interpretation of regulations and their discussion, too, of dimensional tolerances. Next. I just want to leave you with some thoughts about issues of attitude. A paraplegic since an auto accident at age 19, author and National News correspondent John Hockenberry wrote in his critically acclaimed autobiography, Moving Violations, the following: "From the beginning, disability taught that life could be reinvented. In fact, such an outlet was required. The physical dimensions of life could be created. Like poetry, they were not imposed by some celestial landlord. To have invented a way to move without legs was to invent walking. I was inside an experience that felt universally human. There was nothing odd about what I was doing. There was nothing worth staring at. I was just reacting to each physical human problem and solving it with the materials at hand. Inventors weren't shy about disability because they saw the physical details as an interesting problem in engineering. Problem solving brought people together. None of my inventor friends ever asked about my accident. It didn't occur to them. We talked about our inventions. In the great tapestry of form and function, each of these ideas was a single stitch, and the inventors were the weavers. Accessibility, this is very so apropos to work in historic preservation, where solving problems, inventing solutions, dealing with existing conditions is the main skill, I think, for working in historic context. So that's why I really like this quote. And we end with, accessibility is a profoundly human civil right that demands we treat it with the same respect we afford other freedoms we so tenaciously protect. Understanding that makes finding design solutions to physical barriers a natural and ultimately universal part of the process of providing a safe and healthy built environment. Next. So here's the usual disclaimer that I've used my best judgment, but that if you follow my advice, it may or may not coincide with various interpretations. And I have a few minutes left to answer a couple of questions. Someone asked, I have a building listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's 3 stories high with no elevator, and the majority of the building does not comply. All 3 floors have restrooms which do not comply. The question is, and there's a number of questions, do all restrooms have to comply if modifying the restrooms to comply does not threaten or destroy the historic fabric of the building and is readily achievable? The answer to the question is yes. The regular code would apply here. While it doesn't appear that your building would comply with the elevator exception, it being 3 stories, but even if it did, Section 1134B.2.1 in the 2010 CBC states that the elevator exception set forth in this section does not obviate or limit in any way the obligation to comply with the other accessibility requirements in this code. So in other words, even if you don't have an elevator, you don't have a lift, you still have to make those other floors accessible. The next question is, in this situation, is there a reference in the ADA that will give me a definite answer as to whether or not readily achievable items in the building have to be modified, or should there be a mutual agreement between the SHPO and Attorney General or owner and person X to define which items should be modified to comply? Yes, there is a reference. The reference in the 1991 ADA is Section 36.304, Removal of Barriers. And it states, in Part A, that a public accommodation must remove architectural barriers in existing facilities that are readily achievable. And Part C says, it states that a public accommodation is urged to take measures to comply with barrier removal requirements in accordance with the following order of priorities. Number 1 is take measures to provide access to a place of public accommodation from public sidewalks, parking, or transportation, public transportation. 2, provide access to those areas in a place of public accommodation where goods and services are made available to the public. 3, provide access to restroom facilities. And 4, take any other measures necessary to provide access to goods and services of a public accommodation. And finally, I just want to say that the obligation to engage in readily achievable barrier removal is a continuing one. Over time, barrier removal that initially was not readily achievable may later be required because of changed circumstances. So you need to be checking. It's not just if you tried it in the first year, you no longer have that obligation. Another question is, on the same subject, Title III, there is a section that discusses if SHPO states that the building is exempt from ADA compliance due to its historic nature. There are a set of items that still need to comply, i.e. path of travel, restroom service areas on the level where the accessible entrance is located. Does that mean that these items are absolute and should comply no matter what? The answer is no. Assuming you mean access is not readily achievable, there again is still an obligation to do the best you can do to provide some type of services or access. Section 36.304 UDA states, if a barrier is not readily achievable, public accommodation may take other readily achievable measures to remove the barrier that do not fully comply with the specified requirements. Such measures include, for example, providing a ramp with a steeper slope, or widening a doorway to a narrower width, the mandated by the code portable ramps, rearrangement of temporary or movable structures such as furniture, equipment and accessibility racks, and Section 36.305, alternatives to barrier removal, state that where a public accommodation that barrier removal is not readily achievable, the public accommodation shall not fail to make its goods and services, facilities or privileges and advantages or accommodations available through alternative methods. If those methods are not readily achievable, examples of alternatives to barrier removal include, but are not limited to, the following: providing curbside service or home delivery, retrieving merchandise from inaccessible shelves or racks, relocating activities to accessible locations, and also always in thinking of all of these things, no measure, however, shall be taken, that pose a significant risk to the health or safety of individuals with disabilities. The last question is, would these items only be enforced through lawsuits? My response is that, of course, anyone can file a lawsuit, but in my experience in working to resolve conflict, I've found that making a good faith effort to provide the best access you can and letting people know about it through signage and the changes that you provide, the possibilities of a lawsuit are greatly diminished. So I think I'm hearing rumblings. I think I'm out of time. So I want to thank everybody for attending my first webinar. I didn't talk too fast. I gained something from it, and I didn't cough or spit up or do any of those things I was afraid of. That's a good thing.
Yes. Thank you, Arnie. And we are getting to the end of the presentation. So if anybody has any further questions, you can email me. I'll send them along to Arnie. And my email address, many of you already have it, but my email address is CINGRASSIA@californiapreservation.org. And I will be emailing everybody a PDF of the slides that you saw today. And also, many of you want the form for the State Board of Architecture for 1 hour of continuing education. And I will be sending that out tomorrow as well. So if for any reason you don't get that by Friday, please let me know. And a couple of you have signed up for AICP credits, and those unfortunately are not on the website now, but will be in the next week. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining, but especially thank Arnie for speaking and your first webinar. Thank you very much. And if there's any further questions, please let me know. And thank you, everybody, for joining. And hopefully we will see you or hear from you at one of our next webinars. Thank you.